Hello, I'm Nicholas McGeegan, and in a normal year, I would be happily standing in front of symphony orchestras, conducting, making music, and having a lot of fun. But as we all know, this is very far from a normal year. And so I'm very thrilled that the Centre for British Art at Yale has asked me to do a little presentation, in this case about a plague from 1665 in England and other plagues earlier in the century, with verse and some music at the end. From lightning and tempest, from plague, pestilence and famine, from battle and murder, and from sudden death, good Lord, deliver us. These striking words are a versicle from the Anglican Litany written by Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. First published in 1549 and republished in 1662, this passage had great resonance for much of the time in between. The 17th century in Western Europe was a turbulent time and was especially hard hit by plague and battle. In continental Europe, the 30 Years' War ravaged large parts of Germany and later involved both France and Sweden, while in Britain, the civil war between king and parliament divided the country from 1642 to 1651. And we mustn't forget that in Ireland, Elizabeth I, Oliver Cromwell, and King William of Orange fought to suppress the native population. I shall deal with battle later on. As if this man-made death and destruction were not bad enough, plague visited with tragic regularity, killing vast numbers, especially the poorest citizens. In London alone, between 1592 and 1650, there were about 5 visitations of the disease. Indeed, there were very few years when nobody died of plague. It is very hard to get an accurate idea of the death toll, and it is likely that in each case the number of deaths was underreported, but even the approximate figures are horrifying. In this illustration of the mourning cross, the numbers of victims from the various visitations of the plague are listed. 1592-3, up to 20,000 victims. 1603, 30,000. 1625, 41,000. 1626, 10,000. 1645, 5,000. It has been estimated that the plague of 1665 killed about 100,000 people in London, that is to say, about a quarter of the population. There must have been no one whose family was untouched by loss. To give just one famous example, William Shakespeare lost the following members of his family: 2 sisters before he was born, his younger brother Edmund, his only son Hamnet, and later 2 of his grandsons, Richard and Thomas. In addition, in the house where he lived in Silver Street in London, his landlady Marie Mountjoy also probably died of the plague. There is much contemporary information about these sad times in the Bills of Mortality. Here you can see one and note the different causes of death, some of them almost comical, it must be said. And then look at the huge number who died of the plague. In addition, there are pamphlets, handbills, treatises and sermons, and on a more personal level, the letters and diaries of those who survived. The most notable diaries are that of Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn. For the Great Plague of 1665, we have Daniel Defoe's magnificent Journal of the Plague Year, which purports to be an eyewitness account, but was actually written in the 1720s at the time of another plague scare. In addition, we have a wealth of literature, much of it in verse, from throughout the 17th century that captures the despair, fear, and tragedy of the times. Here is an excellent example from Abraham Holland's A Description of the Great, Fearful, and Prodigious Plague from 1626. In what a case poor London stands! To show would ask a pen and muse that only know how to write grief. Alas, it has become a theatre of tragedies, where some died in the first acts, and many slaughters past. God knows what murder shall be in the last. And then a little later, as I do walk along the widowed streets, nothing but sorrow in each face that meets, in a large ruin, nothing but a grief that speaks itself in silence, true and brief. Ah, dear sirs, it is changed from the place you knew it once, when as the beauteous face of gallantry enriched the streets, and eyes of frequent beauty made it a paradise, and the delight of nations, whose concourse thither and the reflux as from the source of mankind did make it seem to be the centre of the world's epitome. Since we're in the midst of a pandemic ourselves, many of the sources from hundreds of years ago will yet have a modern resonance. Some, indeed, of the parallels are unnervingly close. In both the 17th century and now, there are people who offer fake cures, who blame others for the disease, or more generally ascribe it to God's retribution for the sins of mankind, though never their own. There are those who try to flee from the areas of infection, and there are those who self-isolate, like the fictional Jeunesse Dorée in Boccaccio's Decameron in the 14th century. Those of you who've been watching the news will know that right now, Comet Neowise has been visible over the northern hemisphere. Here is a wonderful photograph of it taken by our Scottish neighbour's son, Roddy McDowell, on the island of Bute in western Scotland. Back in the 1660s, there were comets too. As early as 1663, people were getting nervous and looking up to the skies. Henry Moore, a tutor at Christ College, Cambridge, wrote to Lady Conway in January 1663. I am afraid a great mortality is coming upon these nations. The weather here is if it were April or May for warmth. Primroses and violets have been abloom a good while. The birds sing as in spring in the orchard. I believe we shall have an ill after reckoning of all this mirth. There have been many fiery meteors seen, several rivers and wells dried, which shows that there have been considerable changes in the entrails of the earth. I wish these things be not forerunners of some greater mortality. Here is an illustration from John Gadbury's De Cometis, How to Interpret Comets. And here, Samuel Newton, also of Cambridge, writes in December of 1664. The same day in the morning, from about 2 of the clock till 5 in the morning, was seen in the air a comet, which several days latterly has also been seen. The star itself was very little, or not at all bigger than an ordinary star. It had a ray which appeared in the judgment of some to be 20 yards in length, to others the length of a pipe, and to others the length of King's College Chapel. As soon as plague arrived, the city began to close. Here is Defoe from the journal. All the plays and interludes which after the manner of the French court had been set up and began to increase amongst us were forbid to act. The gaming tables, public dancing rooms and music houses, which multiplied and began to debauch the manners of the people, were shut up and suppressed. And the jack puddings, merry andrews, puppet shows, rope dancers, and such like doings, which had bewitched the poor common people, shut up their shops, finding indeed no trade. For the minds of people were agitated with other things, and a kind of sadness and horror at these things sat upon the countenances even of the common people. Death was before their eyes, and everyone began to think of their graves, not of mirth and diversions. In a magnificent modern book entitled The Great Plague, A People's History, Evelyn Lord has this to say about the panic that spread through the country, and particularly London, at the arrival of the plague. Apprehension and anxiety about the pestilence led to panic. Once the cry of plague went up, people began to see plague spots everywhere, on walls, gates and doors, on animals and in the sky. Social prejudices emerge. The plague was the fault of the Dutch, the French, the drunks, the lechers, or the misfits in society. The poor were blamed because they lived in overcrowded, dirty, and unhygienic houses. The plague must be their fault for allowing these conditions to exist. And if the plague was caused by man's sinfulness, then the poor must be especially sinful. One of the most dramatic books is by Thomas Vincent and has the stirring title, God's Terrible Voice in the City. Here is a little bit, gives you the tenor of it. Oh, the boiling, burning lusts that have been in London. Oh, the wanton eyes and looks, the speculative uncleanness and secret self-pollutions, the obscene and filthy speeches, the toying and lustful dalliances, and the gross actual uncleanness which God hath been witness to every day in London. Now most faces gather paleness, and what dismal apprehensions do then fill their minds? What dreadful fears do then possess the spirits, especially of those whose consciences are full of guilt and have not made their peace with God? The old drunkards and swearers and unclean people are brought into great straits. They look on the right hand and on the left, and death is marching towards them from every part, and they know not where to fly that they may escape it. All the people who could afford it, that is to say the court, the aristocracy, and the Inns of Court, anybody with money, tried to get out of London as fast as they could, in every plague, from the 16th century onwards. Here is a little bit from John Davis's poem, The Triumph of Death, from 1630. Now, like to bees in summer's heat from hives, out fly the citizens, some here, some there, some all alone, and others with their wives. With wives and children some fly, all for fear. Here stands a watch with guard of partisans to stop their passages, or to or fro, as if they were not men nor Christians, but fiends or monsters murdering as they go. Defoe adds, everyone was at peace. There was no occasion for lawyers. Whole rows of houses in some places were shut close up. The inhabitants all fled, and only a watchman or two left. Here is a letter from the Reverend Stephen Byng to the Dean of St. Paul's, dated July the 27th, 1665. The increase of God's judgment deads people's hearts, that trading strangely ceaseth, and bills of exchange are not accepted, so that they shut up their shops, and such a fear possesseth them, that it's wonderful to see how they hurry into the country, as though the same God were not there as he is in the city, so that those that are living and lived in the great sickness time saw, nor knew not the like, when there died 4,000 a week. I pray God to prevent a sad sequel. the city council issued orders about keeping the streets clean, especially dealing with animals who it was thought helped the disease to spread. Orders for cleaning and keeping of the streets sweet, that no hogs, dogs or cats or tame pigeons or conies be suffered to be kept within any part of the city, or any swine to be or stray in the streets or lanes, but that such swine be impounded by the beadle or any other officer, and the owner punished according to the Act of Common Council, and that dogs be killed by the dog killers appointed for that purpose. It has been estimated that 40,000 dogs were killed and 200,000 cats. Here is Defoe. I should observe that the court removed early in the month of June and went to Oxford, where it pleased God to preserve them, and the distemper did not, as I heard of, so much as touch them, for which I cannot say that I ever saw they showed any great token of thankfulness, and hardly anything of reformation, though they did not want being told that their crying vices might, without breach of charity, be said to have gone far in bringing that terrible judgment upon the whole nation. George Wither, in his poem Britain's Remembrancer, says much the same thing in elegant verse. The Parliament had left her to go see if they could learn at Oxford to agree, or if that air were better for the health and safety of the English Commonwealth. Anthony Wood, a wonderful academic from Oxford, wrote his journal throughout the latter part of the 17th century, was not very pleased to see them. He wrote, although the court was neat and gay in their apparel, they were very nasty and beastly, and Wood claimed that at their departure, rude, rough, vain, empty, careless, and the courtiers left excrements in every corner, in chimneys, studies, coal-house and cellars. One scholar who departed Cambridge was Isaac Newton. He was a student at Trinity College, and in 1665, at the onset of plague, he returned home to Woolsthorpe in Lincolnshire, his family's house. In old age, he told his niece's husband, John Condit, who was collecting material to write Newton's life, that it was while in exile at Woolsthorpe that he discovered his system of gravity, the first hint of it coming when he saw a loose apple fall from a tree. In Alabama, I believe it is, there have been parties where young students, not very bright ones obviously, have been trying to get COVID for whatever reasons they might have. And way back in the 1660s, the same thing happened for a rather strange reason. It was thought that some of the symptoms of plague resembled those of venereal disease. Some believed that a dose of the clap could be a preventative against the plague and went out of their way to catch it. Less dramatic fake cures are beautifully enumerated in John Taylor's poem, The Fearful Summer. And any of the simplest mountebanks may cheat them, as they will, of coin and thanks, with scraped powder of a shoeing horn, which they'll believe is of an unicorn. Angelica's distasteful root is gnawed, and herb of grace most ruefully is chawed. Garlic offendeth neither taste nor smell, fear and opinion makes it relish well. Whilst bezoar stone and mighty mithridate to all degrees are great in estimate, and treacle's powder is wonderfully expressed, and dragon water in most high request, These 'gainst the plague are good preservatives. Some of the cures, I must say, are really quite bizarre. Here is one which I hope nobody will think of trying. Take a live frog and lay the belly of it next to the plague sore. If the patient will escape, the frog will burst in 1 hour. Then lay on another, and this you do till no more burst, for they do draw forth the venom. If none of the frogs do burst, the party will not escape. This hath been frequently tried. Some do say of dried toad will do it better. And here is William Boghurst with another remedy. I laid a great mastiff puppy dog upon her breast 2 or 3 hours together, and made her drink dill, pennyroyal, fennel, and aniseed water, for she was a fat woman and could bear it. Here, I must say, is a plague remedy that I rather like: the virtue and use of coffee as a cure for the plague. One of the stranger cures was thought to be tobacco. Here is Samuel Pepys, 7th of June, 1665. This day, much against my will, I did in Drury Lane see 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors, and Lord have mercy upon us writ there, which was a sad sight to me, being the first of that kind that to my remembrance I ever saw. It put me into an ill conception of myself and my smell, so that I was forced to buy some rolled tobacco to smell and to chew, which took away the apprehension. Smoking was even forced upon the students at Eton College. Here is Thomas Hearne's journal from January the 21st, 1721. I have been told that in the last great plague at London, none that kept tobacconists' shops had the plague. It is certain that smoking was looked upon as a most excellent preservative, insomuch that even children were obliged to smoke. And I remember that I heard formerly Tom Rogers, who was yeoman beadle, say that when he was at Eton, all the boys of that school were obliged to smoke in the school every morning, and that he was never whipped so much in his life as he was one morning for not smoking. One fashion that was thought to be possibly dangerous was wearing wigs. Here is Samuel Pepys again. 3rd of September, 1665, Lord's Day. Up and put on my coloured silk suit, very fine, and my new periwig, bought a good while since, but durst not wear it because the plague was in Westminster when I bought it. And it is a wonder what will be the fashion after the plague is done as to periwigs, for nobody will dare to buy any hair for fear of the infection, that it been cut off the heads of people dead of the plague. Fear of letters. During the present pandemic, and way back in the 17th century, there was a certain panic about handling the mail. Here is Defoe describing a friend of his. His letters were brought by the postman or letter carrier to his porter, when he caused the porter to smoke them with brimstone and with gunpowder, then opened them and to sprinkle them with vinegar. Then he had them drawn up by the pulley, then smoked again with strong perfumes, And taking them with a pair of hair gloves, the hair outermost, he read them with large reading glasses, which read at a great distance. And as soon as they were read, burnt them in the fire. And at last, the distemper raging more and more, he forbid his friends writing to him at all. In an email this week, a friend of mine told me that his neighbour in London puts his mail in the freezer overnight, which is perhaps a slightly less drastic version than covering it in brimstone. August the 30th, 1665. Up betimes, and to my business of settling my house and papers, and then abroad, and met with Hadley, our clerk, who, upon me asking how the plague goes, he told me it increases very much, and much in our parish. For, says he, there died 9 this week, though I have returned but 6. Which is a very ill practice, and makes me think it is so in other places, and therefore the plague much greater than people take it to be. The following day. Every day, sadder and sadder news of its increase. In the city died this week 7,496, and of them 6,102 of the plague. But it is feared that the true number of dead this week is nearer 10,000, partly from the poor that cannot be taken notice of through the greatness of their number, and partly from the Quakers and others that will not have any bell ring for them. Now death rides triumphantly on his pale horse through our streets, and breaks into almost every house where any inhabitants are to be found. Now people fall as thick as leaves from the trees in autumn, when they are shaken by a mighty wind. Now there is a dismal solitude in London's streets. Now shops are shut in. Very few people walk about, insomuch that the grass begins to spring up in some places, and a deep silence almost in every place, especially within the walls. No rattling coaches, no prancing horses, no calling in customers, no offering wares, no London cries sounding in the ears. If any voice is heard, it is the groans of dying people breathing forth their last, and the funeral knells of those who are ready to be carried to their graves. One enormous difference between then and now is that during the plague in London and any city, village in the United Kingdom, bells rang for the dead more or less constantly, the death knells. Here is a little bit of London's Misery, a very fine poem by Richard Milton. Go on, my muse, now, and right sadly tell the doleful sound that every parish bell within this poor afflicted city make, that we may from our sinful lives awake. Our daily sorrows and continual fears, our loss of dear friends, and our daily tears, that we for them do shed the sundry moans, deep-hearted sighings and grievous groans, that many a husband for his tender wife sends forth for her that is bereaved of life. And here from John Taylor, The Fearful Summer. Now hear and mark the mournful music of the ear. There do the brazen, iron-tongued loud bells, death's clamorous music, ring continuous knells. Some lofty in their notes, some sadly tolling, whilst fatal dogs make a most dismal howling. Some frantic raving, some with anguish crying, some singing, praying, groaning, and some dying. The healthful grieving and the sickly groaning, all in a mournful diapason moaning. Thus universal sorrowful complaining is all the music now in London reigning. Thus is her comfort sad calamity, and all her melody is malady. These are the objects of the eyes and ears, most woeful sights and sounds of griefs and fears. In 1603, Shakespeare paid for the bells of St. Mary Overy in Southwark to be rung for his brother's funeral. Although this was a terrible time for almost everybody, certain things did brighten the mood, if only temporarily. Here is something from a letter by Henry Muddiman, which shows how somebody surprised his family by surviving the plague. A butcher in Newgate Market, being by the searchers given out to be dead of the plague, and by the neglect of the boarders not carried away the same night, was laid out in the upper room, whither his daughter going next day, the father beckoned to her and bade her bring him ale, for he was cold. The daughter called upon her mother, who giving him clothes, the man took a pipe of tobacco, ate a rabbit, and on Sunday went to church to give God thanks for his preservation. Here is a scene that could really come directly from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Daniel Defoe describes how somebody got put onto the dead cart by mistake. At length the cart came to the place where the bodies were to be thrown into the ground, which, as I do remember, was at Mount Hill. And as the cart usually stopped some time before they were ready to shoot out the melancholy load they had in it, as soon as the cart stopped, the fellow awaked and struggled a little to get his head out from amongst the dead bodies, when, raising himself up in the cart, he cried, "Hey, where am I?" This frighted the fellow that attended about the work, but after some pause, John Hayward, recovering himself, said, "Lord bless us, there's someone in the cart not quite dead." So another called to him and said, "Who are you?" And the fellow answered, "I'm the poor piper. Where am I?" "Where are you?" says Howard. "Why, you're in the dead cart, and we were going to bury you." "But I ain't dead yet, though, am I?" says the piper, which made them laugh a little, though, as John said, they were heartily frighted at first. On August the 15th, 1665, Pepys had a dream. Up by 4 o'clock and walked to Greenwich, where called at Captain Cook's, and to his chamber, he being in bed, where something put my last night's dream into my head, which I think is the best that ever was dreamed, which was that I had my Lady Castlemaine in my arms, and was admitted to use all the dalliance I desired with her, and then dreamed that this could not be awake, but that it was only a dream. But that since it was a dream, and that I took so much real pleasure in it, what a happy thing it would be when we are in our graves, as Shakespeare resembles it, we could dream and dream but such dreams as this, that then we should not need to be so fearful of death as we are in this plague time. We are apt to think of the plague as being confined to London, or at least major cities, and all being over in 1665. But in fact, the disease spread to other parts of the country, and the disease continued well into the following year. Eyam is a small village in the Peak District of Derbyshire. Indeed, it's very close to where I used to live in the 1970s. Every summer, villages in Derbyshire hold celebrations that used to be known as Wakes Week, and the local speciality is to dress the village wells with flowers. Here, in fact, is an image from Overhaddon, which is the village I used to live in. This is a centuries-old tradition. As you can see, it still flourishes. But in 1665, tragedy struck. A bale of cloth was sent to the local tailor for him to provide special festive costumes for the villagers. It was opened by George Vickers, the tailor's assistant, who hung the bale in front of the fire to dry. However, the bale contained fleas infected with the plague, which quickly spread. Vickers was the first casualty, and by November 1666, about 260 of the village population of about 350 had died. What makes Eyam so special is that the Reverend William Mompesson, who was the vicar, basically self-isolated the village. No one was allowed in or out. Money was left on the boundary stone for food which would be left there, and no one was allowed in or out of the village. In August of 1666, Mompesson's own wife died of the plague. His children had left long before. Here is part of a letter that he wrote to his children, telling them the sad news. Eyam, August the 31st, 1666. Dear hearts, this brings you the doleful news of your dearest mother's death, the greatest loss that could befall you. I am deprived of a kind and loving consort, and you are bereaved of the most indulgent mother that ever poor children had. Dear children, your blessed mother lived a holy life and made a comfortable end, though by means of the sore pestilence, and she is now invested with a crown of righteousness. Further, I can assure you, my sweet babes, that her love to you was little inferior to that she felt for me. You little imagine with what delight she used to talk of you both, and the pains she took when you sucked your milk from her breasts is almost incredible. She gave a strong testimony of her love for you when she lay upon her deathbed. I question not, my dear hearts, that the reading of this account will cause many a salt tear to spring from your eyes. Yet let this comfort you, your dear mother is now a saint in heaven. In Thomas Cranmer's litany with which I began, battle and sudden death come after plague and the pestilence in his list of things to be delivered from. Musicians generally are not known for their fighting prowess, though there are a few exceptions, such as the Chevalier de Saint-Georges at the time of the French Revolution, who was a composer, virtuoso violinist, as well as one of the finest swordsmen in Paris. In 17th century England, most musicians were associated with the royal court or the church, and so when the Civil War broke out, many of them found themselves without employment. However, one notable musician joined the King's Life Guards and sadly died at the Siege of Chester in 1645. He was William Laws, who with his brother Henry were members of King Charles's most intimate musical circle. The King was a fine gamba player, and both Laws brothers wrote exquisite music for the Royal Consort of Viols. But they also wrote a lot of wonderful songs and some keyboard music. Here are two little keyboard pieces by William Laws, a symphony and a saraband in G minor. At the Battle of Rowton Heath, just outside Chester, Lawes was shot by a Roundhead soldier on September the 24th, 1645. The king honoured him posthumously with the title of Father of Music. His rather cryptic epitaph is by Thomas Jordan. Concord is conquered. In this urn there lies the master of great music's mysteries, and in it is a riddle like a cause. Will Lawes was slain by such whose will were laws. On the 30th of January 1649, King Charles I was beheaded outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. For the composer Thomas Tomkins, organist of Worcester Cathedral, it must have felt as if his entire world had come to an end. He was 76, pretty old for the time. His first wife had died, his house had been badly damaged by a cannonball, the cathedral had been desecrated by Roundhead troops, and his beloved organ on which he played had been destroyed. For Tomkins, who had written the music for the king's coronation, the execution of his sovereign was the last straw. 2 weeks later, on February the 14th, 1649, he wrote this fine keyboard piece, a sad pavane for these distracted times. I began with a litany, so it only seems fitting to end with one. A Litany in Time of Plague by Thomas Nash. Adieu, farewell, earth's bliss, this world uncertain is. Fond are life's lustful joys, death proves them all but toys. None from his darts can fly. I am sick, I must die, Lord have mercy on us. Rich men trust not in wealth, gold cannot buy you health. Physic himself must fade, all things to end are made. The plague full swift goes by. I am sick, I must die, Lord have mercy upon us. Beauty is but a flower which wrinkles will devour. Brightness falls from the air. Queens have died young and fair. Dust hath closed Helen's eye. I am sick, I must die. Lord have mercy upon us. Strength stoops upon the grave. Worms feed on Hector brave. Swords may not fight with fate. Earth still holds open her gate. Come, come, the bells do cry. I am sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy upon us. Wit with his wantonness tasteth death's bitterness. Hell's executioner hath no ears for to hear what vain art can reply. I am sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy upon us. Haste, therefore, each degree to welcome destiny. Heaven is our heritage, earth but a player's stage. Mount we unto the sky. I am sick, I must die. Lord, have mercy upon us. But then, in 1666, this happened.